exploring the link between globalization, transnational migrant flows, and human trafficking. So thank you, all of you. It's great to see so many of you here. And thank those of you, and I recognize some of you, who have joined us for every single panel in this series. It's been a wonderful collaboration between the University Library, the Chicano Latino Studies, Modern Languages, Theater Arts, Associated Student Productions, and Residential Life. And I think it's been incredibly successful. I appreciate that. It looks like you guys thought so too, so it's wonderful to hear. So we're really lucky today to be joined by 3 panelists. I'm going to start introducing them from left to right, which we're doing is right to left. Anyway, raise your hand when I say it. We'll do that. So Jennifer Musto is a PhD candidate in Women's Studies at UCLA. She's writing a dissertation about the experiences of trafficking victims in the Netherlands and in the United States. And she's teaching a class at UCLA called Gender, Human Trafficking, and Social Justice, where she talks both about dominant anti-trafficking ideologies as well as alternative anti-trafficking interventions. In addition to human trafficking, Ms. Musto is interested in sex worker and immigrant rights, and transnational and European feminism and human rights. In the middle, we have Annie Fukushima, a PhD candidate in ethnic studies with a designated emphasis in women, gender, and sexuality at UC Berkeley. Her research also looks at transnational feminisms, gender, migration, visual culture, and social movements through the lens of human trafficking. She is currently an instructor at Lynne College in the Department of Ethnic Studies, and until recently she was working with the SAGE project. SAGE is the Standing Against Global Exploitation, that's what it stands for, project, as their lead trafficking case manager and program coordinator. She is also on the board of directors for the National Coalition Against Domestic Violence and the board of advisors for Survivors Today. And then finally, last but not least, we are joined by Officer Jennifer Donsler, who works with the San Jose Police Vice Squad, and there she coordinates the Human Trafficking Task Force, a joint project between the San Jose Police Department, Santa Clara District's Attorney, and the FBI, among other organizations. And she's a 26-year veteran of the force who's going to tell us about her experiences in the field. So I will now give the floor to her.
Thank you for that warm introduction, and I think we may have to put the projector on. Oh, and there it is. So thank you all for your attention to this issue, and also to the folks who have organized this event. I think it really speaks highly to Sonoma State University that immigration is on the radar, and that this is an opportunity to bring together folks from across different disciplines to engage the issue. So it's wonderful to see you all and to actually get out of my Los Angelino locale to the beautiful hills of Sonoma. So thank you for welcoming me. I also want to thank Annie and Jennifer for joining me on this panel. Sometimes it's rare when talking about this issue to be able to sit with others who are experts. So my hope is that I will kind of flesh out some of the broader issues related to human trafficking, and then we'll get to the more specific ways in which it affects the different communities in which we live in. So to begin with, I wanted to give you a broad overview of what we mean when we talk about human trafficking. It's likely something that many of you have seen in the media. There are countless news reports and Hollywood films dedicated to the issue. But I wanted to give you a sense for how scholars particularly talk about it. So oftentimes, human trafficking is seen as the most coercive form of movement on a continuum of movement practices. So I like to think visually. If we imagine human trafficking on a continuum of movement practices, it's the most coercive or the most exploitative version next to smuggling and voluntary migration. So scholars see it as a kind of dark side of globalization. Lots of people are moving across borders. They're coming from rural areas to urban areas. Human trafficking is the most coercive or the most exploitative form of movement. Now this can be a little tricky because though we have legal definitions that distinguish it from, say, smuggling, in fact, these designations and the differences between smuggling or voluntary movement are somewhat tricky to identify. So a leading issue that we talk about with human trafficking is what is it that distinguishes it from other forms of movement? so too have scholars engaged the issue in thinking about it as a form of female sexual slavery or sex slavery, modern-day slavery, or forced labor. So as you can see from this list, and I'm happy, I should mention after, to share this PowerPoint with you for those of you who want to think about this issue in greater depth, is that there are a lot of different things that are talked about when we talk about human trafficking, which again can be tricky when we're trying to distinguish who is a victim and who is not. So I think it's always important to think about the various ways in which people can be trafficked for. So if we think that if we know that human trafficking is a forced form of movement, they're often being trafficked for particular purposes. So I wanted to give you a breakdown of some of the various ways that the various purposes for which people can be trafficked. The first and most notable is forced prostitution or sex trafficking. So while we have legal definitions, and I'll get to that later, that say that trafficking can be for non-sexual purposes, the bulk of responses to date have really focused our attention on forced prostitution and sex trafficking. And this is not just a contemporaneous issue. In fact, sociologists and historians remind us that the issue of human trafficking historically has also focused overwhelmingly on sex trafficking. So a lot of the historical legacies of how this issue has been dealt with also come back when we think about it and look at it from a contemporary lens. Increasingly, we're also seeing cases of domestic servitude at work. That is, people being trafficked to work in houses as domestic workers or nannies. And increasingly, we're also seeing sweatshop labor and bonded labor. So I wanted to actually give you some visual culture of this. I'm going to skip ahead to show you a local example of this. This is the image of the Almonte sweatshop case that took place in 1995 in Los Angeles. And so it's a really kind of visual representation of the ways in which people can be trafficked when specific to sweatshop labor. So this was the Almonte sewing factory and living room, in which 72 Thai nationals were found working against their will, actually for clothing that would go to department stores like formerly what was called Robinson's May or Nordstrom's. So we know historically and from a local perspective that sweatshop labor has been one variation for which people have been trafficked. And I'll go back to my list. We also have seen cases of agricultural labor. Some of you may have seen in the news the big case that broke against Global Horizons, in which 200 Thai male workers were trafficked to work in the various agricultural fields, and some were trafficked to Hawaii, California, and throughout Washington. And in my own neck of the woods, there was a case in 2008 with Filipino workers who were trafficked to provide elderly care. So all of these examples are meant to illustrate that traffickers are extraordinarily resourceful in thinking about ways that people can be forced to work against their will in a variety of different, for a variety of different purposes. I also included there nail salons, restaurants, and dry cleaners, and that's more commonplace in another country that I look at, which is the Netherlands. So I think it's also important for us to think about why are we talking about trafficking now? What is specific to the issue of trafficking, and why does it come up, and why is it such an important issue now? Sociologists have been keen to point out that class, poverty, and urbanization are key push factors. So as more people are migrating from rural communities to urban centers in search of work, as we see a kind of divide between the global north and the global south in terms of economic issues, these really push people to move in order to migrate in search of better lives. We also see trafficking come up where there are militarization and or environmental disasters. And I'd be curious what my co-panelists think about this, but I think in the wake of environmental disasters, this also creates the opportunity for more people to desire to move because of in search of jobs and stability for themselves and their family's livelihood. And I wanted to jump to the last point, which is that we talk about trafficking now because we're in the midst of a broader push right now in which criminalization of cross-border movements is taking place. So some of the other speakers in the series may have drawn your attention to this, but as we have begun to kind of clamp down on the border, as there are border panics and increasing anxieties about who is and who is not allowed to be included and to be full members of the nation state, we also see issues of more exploitative forms of movement taking place. A way to think about this are coyotes, or people who help to bring people across borders. somebody may have consented to having themselves moved across the border, but actually, legally speaking, if there's some kind of coercion involved for the purposes for which people will be trafficked, that actually constitutes trafficking. So we can talk more about that towards the end. But we see border panics and a larger push to criminalize immigration as one of the reasons we're paying more attention to these more exploitative cases of human trafficking. Now, I showed you one slide already about the El Monte sweatshop case, and this was really important in Los Angeles because it put a local face on a very global issue. So if we know that borders are opening up, more and more people are moving. The El Monte case was one of the first instances in LA County where people began to say, you know what, actually what we may have historically seen as a kind of smuggling case or a voluntary migration case, in fact turned out to be something much more exploitative. So I showed a few images already. This was, on the face of it, a very kind of nondescript housing compound. But upon closer look, this compound had barbed wire in which the 72 Thai nationals were working. I showed you a bit about the living room and sewing room factory. It's hard to see in this image because it's somewhat dated. But in fact, all of the windows were completely painted over, so the Thai workers had no access to sunlight. Many of them had lived there for countless years, I think some up to 8 years, without having been able to leave the buildings. And this is another image to give you a sense of the living quarters that they were living in while working in this factory. And a common tactic, and this may be brought up with the other presenters, is the confiscation of passports. So sometimes the question is, if people are doing this exploitative kinds of work, why don't they just leave? You know, what is it about these conditions that just doesn't allow them to leave? Well, in the El Monte case, and in several other cases, one of the ways of keeping people in these coercive working situations is through the confiscation of passports, which these Thai nationals had also had taken from them. So I wanted to also give you a sense of the numbers, because again, many of you may have come across some of the visual imagery about what is the scope of the problem. Oftentimes people ask, okay, if we're dealing with this global phenomena, we know it's an increasing problem, what's really the quantitative number of the issue? So I included one image from an organization called Not For Sale, where the number 27 million people are enslaved today. So I wanted to break down what scholars and qualitative and quantitative theorists have told us, in fact, about the numbers. So on the one hand, we have this 12 million to 27 million number thrown around. The U.S. government gives a different estimate. They estimate that between 600 and 800,000 people are trafficked across international boundaries every year, and as many as 18,000 people are trafficked into the United States every year. So admittedly, I'm not a quantitative researcher, but for those of you who do like numbers and statistics, you may realize that this number between the projected 12 to 27 million to 18,000, there's a far jump, right? There's a lot of room in between that. And in the United States, since 2000, when the first legislation came to the fore on trafficking, we've identified approximately 1,379 cases. This number may need to be updated based on previous research. But the point to take away from all of this is that we have identified far fewer cases of trafficking, despite the recognition that as many as 12 to 27 million people may be enslaved worldwide. And in the interest of time, I'm just going to briefly give you a legal backdrop of how the U.S. has defined trafficking, which is culminated in the form of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And Annie will speak more specifically to this. But one of the things to really keep in mind with the definition of the U.S., the TVPA, is that sex trafficking has really been at the fore. So remember the earlier slide when I talked about the various ways in which people can be trafficked. In the United States context, the vast majority of cases that have been pursued have been for the purposes of sex trafficking. It should be noted that that's beginning to change. We are seeing more identified cases of agricultural and other forms of trafficking cases, but really historically since 2000, the advent of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act, the bulk of law enforcement response and the bulk of social service response has been on sex trafficking. And I wanted just to conclude with the rest of the definition. Trafficking is defined as the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor or services through the use of force, fraud, or coercion. And maybe the last thing I'll leave you with is that the last part of the definition, which becomes really difficult, is how do you define coercion? How do you define force or fraud? And so, again, I think we'll have some more specific case studies to look at. But it's a really tenuous issue that often overlaps with a number of intersecting phenomena. And I'm excited to hear the rest of the panels and to engage in some of your questions about the issue more generally. So thank you.
That was great. Can everyone hear me okay? I can't tell if the mic is picking up, actually. Okay, great. So I titled my contribution for today as Trauma, Remembering, and the Witness, Human Trafficking in California. And here's a quick roadmap of what I hope to share with you. 15 minutes is not a whole lot of time to really get at the meat of what human trafficking looks like for a survivor and for those that work with them directly. But hopefully I'll be able to share with you some of the experiences that I've had with working with survivors of human trafficking, both international cases as well as domestic, which means U.S. citizens that are trafficked in the United States, within the United States. And so what I'm going to share with you is what is human trafficking, some case samples, and the role of the witness. So human trafficking is systemic, and I think that Jennifer did a great job of illuminating what that means and what that looks like for the global context as well as really bringing it here to California. It is also normalized as invisible. We've seen many cases in which human trafficking happened in urban areas, in the city, and people didn't know it was happening. They may have seen something. We've seen a case in which, for example, and I'll go into it a little bit more, a woman was in domestic servitude for 2 years. She walked the children to school every single day. The school teacher saw her, the neighbors saw her, but no one did anything. And I think that it's really normalized in the sense of that we don't really know that it's happening, or we may not know that it's happening, and we don't take the time to get to know the people that are in our community, in our neighborhoods, as complex beings with complex histories, whether they're immigrants or someone that's surviving in the sex industry. Also, human trafficking, one of the things that I think that we tend to also, and not you, maybe not you here in this audience, but I've seen happen in media reports of human trafficking, for example, is that oftentimes human trafficking is seen as over there, whether that over there is outside of Northern California, somewhere else, not happening here in my neighborhood. For you, that would be Sonoma. For me, that would be in San Francisco Bay Area. It's also seen as back then. We know that in 1865, human slavery was abolished, but there have been multiple passages of different acts that I know Jennifer with San Jose PD is going to tell you a little bit more about, of some of the initiatives that are going on to counteract and to solve this issue legally, as well as through law enforcement. But one of the things is that we can say that human trafficking is historic, and oftentimes we see it as back then over there. But what we know about human trafficking is that it is traumatic. It's traumatic to the person as well as to the community, the body of the individual as well as the body of the collective, you here, the United States, and so forth. But what it does, being traumatic, is it breaks a person's sense of safety and their sense of trust. And that's what we know that human trafficking on a bodily level does. And I think that one of the things, because human trafficking is traumatic, is that we oftentimes want to forget it. But I think the reality is that it's a part of us, it's a part of our communities here, and that is because of the systems that are in place that have normalized it. And I wanted to share with you a Toni Morrison quote to really, I think she does a really great job of getting at sort of the hauntings that we're living with, both lived, embodied, as well as disembodied. Toni Morrison shows us not only that slavery was violent and exploitive a system, but also that even when it was supposed to be over, it could turn to haunt the living, making Reconstruction and the freedoms it passes on to us today our haunting inheritance. So we are living in a haunting, but we are also living with the reality of it, both the haunting and the real. So what is human trafficking? You saw the Trafficking Victims Protection Act sort of read to you, and it looks like a long list of many words. But experts, with law enforcement as well as social service providers, have worked to really simplify the definition so we can really try our best. Even though it's challenging to identify human trafficking, these cases are complicated. I don't think I've ever seen a simple case come in where it wasn't like, well, they've also participated in their exploitation, or there's some other factor that makes it not such a simple, they were literally just in a slave-like condition, no complexities. I've never seen a non, I don't know if you can agree with that, that every single case is unique, nuanced, and they bring, what they do is they really show us new information about what human trafficking is and the current definitions that we have. So to simplify it, the Trafficking Victims Act, what we've developed, or the anti-trafficking movement has developed, is what is called the AMP model. So that's action, means, and process. So you need an action, you need a means, and then you have a process. So what it looks like is a person is recruited, harbored, transported, or they are provided or obtained through force, fraud, coercion, abduction, or manipulation for the purpose of their sex or labor. But just to simplify it, you don't need to have every single thing in that long list of the legal definition. You really just need one. So for example, Betty could be obtained through force for the purpose of her sex, and that's trafficking. So what is force? Force is when someone literally beats you, right? They physically hurt you. Fraud. Fraud is a nice way to say lies. They tell you lies. They say, if you come to the United States, you can get this job as a nanny, and you will be paid well, you'll learn English, you'll learn how to drive, but instead the person ends up not paid and living in unlivable conditions. Coercion is if you try to leave law enforcement is out there and they're going to arrest you. They're watching you like vultures. They're out there. So if you leave, they're going to arrest you. Or if you leave, I am going to kill your family. If you leave, I am going to kill you. And those are sort of the storylines that survivors of human trafficking often hear. And so I can go in forever into unpacking that definition, but I don't have a lot of time. We can always revisit it, and I know Jennifer can also contribute a lot to that legal definition. So what has been witnessed in the media to date of profiled public cases? There are many cases that you do not hear about. And the reason why you don't hear about it is because the media hasn't heard about them, or they're just not high public cases. The Peruvian case that I was referring to of the domestic worker that was trafficked into the private home, that one became high-profile case. It was here in California. But just to give you a sense of other cases, so that one happened in 2009. The 1995 one was also a high-profile case. We've also seen 48 Thai welders that were trafficked with the intention of them working on the Bay Bridge. But instead of them working on the Bay Bridge, only 11 of them ended up on the Bay Bridge. The rest of them were sent to Southern California with the purpose of them being exploited in restaurants. We've also seen 100 Korean women that were trafficked into San Francisco massage parlors. That case was called Operation Gilded Cage, and it was because it was a raid that was initiated by law enforcement. Social service providers came to support and see how they could support the case, but the numbers were huge. 100 people, can you imagine? 100 people, and you have 3 social service providers in San Francisco that are meant to respond to them. Shelter with bed of 15 beds, maybe another one, and not even all of those beds are available. And so we really did not have enough resources to respond to that particular case. But there are those large cases that do happen that get high publicity. And I can tell you more nuances about what the ins and outs of that case look like in a bit. But one of the things that we know about human trafficking is that it's geographically, politically, economically, and socially defined. And so what we see here in Northern California may look quite different than what happens in Los Angeles. It doesn't mean it's super different. We're still California, but as we know, Northern and Southern California are quite different contexts that's happening here. And we know in San Francisco that it is a city that oftentimes people see as a city of sex, right? You can go to San Francisco and buy sex. And so I think that those kinds of things that define particular regions do impact the types of human trafficking cases that we're seeing. And just to give you a sense of what I saw with an agency that I worked with, the Standing Against Global Exploitation Project, in 2009 to 2010, myself alone, I responded to 52 crisis cases. And then I also long-term helped 23 cases in a 2-year span. That's a lot of cases that one agency is seeing alone. And I know law enforcement sees a lot of cases that may not get prosecuted as trafficking because there's just not enough evidence. And so not all of these cases will lead to prosecution of human trafficking. But when we look at the legal definition as it stands right now, they are legally defined as human trafficking. I also oversaw 50 domestic minor cases, which means U.S. children that were trafficked. And of those cases, about 95% of them were trafficked into the sex industry. And that's because there's a demand. If you were to just open up any sort of advertisement, whether it was Craigslist when they had advertisements, or if you were to go to My Red Book, any sort of, and I'm not encouraging you to go to My Red Book, it's an escort website, but if that's what you want to see, then you have to be 18 and older. And so one of the things about that is that if you go to it, there is a demand for girls. You'll see literally everywhere, girls, girls, girls. And I think that what we know about the sex industry is that there is a demand for children. So sex trafficking, there's many types, and I don't want to sort of stereotype that there's only one type. From the internet, we've seen individuals trafficked through Craigslist, not happening now as much because they shut down their adult industry section, but we do see it on sites such as Backpage, which is the new web page that minors are being trafficked on. We see it in the sex industry. The sex industry is locally and nationally defined. So what we call a sex industry here in the United States is something like massage parlors, strip clubs, to escort services. But if you were to go to another country, they may define the sex industry a little bit differently because it may look different in their location. It's also sex trafficking of minors. So minors can include survival sex. So that is, I need a place to stay. I'm a 15-year-old. I'm homeless. I was kicked out by my parents. I have nowhere to stay. And so an adult approaches them and says, well, you can stay with me, but you need to sleep with me. And that sort of exchange of value would be defined or identified as a form of sex trafficking. And so that's what Office of Victims of Crime has really enabled organizations like the SAGE Project, Salvation Army, and Safe Horizons in New York to identify those kind of cases. We also know that it's international, so U.S. citizens going abroad to buy sex and other illicit forms as well. Labor trafficking is, I forgot my own order of my own presentation, so I apologize. I was going to share a little bit about some cases, though. So I made a reference to the 100 Koreans that were trafficked into San Francisco through Operation Gilded Cage. With that particular case, I remember when law enforcement interviewed many of the women, one of the questions they asked, because this is to show, to find out whether or not there was force, fraud, or coercion, they asked them, could you leave? And so when we think of human trafficking, we think that oftentimes the person is unable to physically leave the location. But that's a stereotype. Many of these women could leave. They were able to leave. But the thing was, no one asked them is, did you have your passport? What language did you speak? They were monolingual Korean speaking, so how would they know where to go? And if you could go, where would you go? Do you know of resources? Do you have anything to get somewhere else? So that was one particular case that was a large case. I think that the challenge with that we had to respond very quickly, and there wasn't enough time to identify, because one of the things we know about human trafficking, if you remember earlier I said it breaks trust and safety, is that it takes a long time to build that relationship with survivors of human trafficking men. And so sometimes in the first, the second, the third, it may take 3 months of interviews, of conversations, of outreach, before they'll even start to disclose anything about the trauma that they're going through. A domestic case of sex trafficking would be, and this is very common, a minor in Oakland. She's an African-American child. She may be in the foster system. And so one of the things that we know about her is that she meets her boyfriend. He tells her, oh, baby, I'm going to buy you all these things. I'm going to take care of you. You're my girl. But all you need to do is go sleep in that hotel and sleep with people, and because we're broke, we need some money. So she will go and do that because she loves him. She literally loves him. And then he ends up pimping her out as a minor, and she may cross the Bay Bridge. You don't need movement to be trafficked. You could be literally trafficked out of your own home. And for those of you that are interested in reading a book, there's a book that is called The Sacred Bath that can tell you more about the case scenario of a U.S. Citizen that as a minor was literally trafficked out of her own home. I have many slides. I was going to go more into labor trafficking, but I can always revisit those slides for you. I did want to go into the issue of the witness. So with domestic cases, we've seen domestic servitude to U.S. citizens that were selling magazines. There were forced. So these were homeless youth that were forced to sell magazines on the street. So even U.S. citizens can be labor trafficked. So witness. Who is this witness that I talked about? Well, oftentimes we think that the person that survives a trauma is their witness to their own trauma. But what we know about human trafficking is that there are many witnesses out there. It could be a neighbor, a family member, an employer, a coworker, an educator. So you in this space, the students, lawyers, service providers, medical professionals. There are many witnesses that are out there, and I think that one of the things is it's being informed about what is the issue, because if you think you see something, then the next step is you should know what your resources are then. And so one more thing I did want to say is that to revisit that human trafficking is systemic, seen as over there and normalized, but what we know is that in order to address the systemic aspect of human trafficking, our solutions must address the systemic reasons why people are exploited. So we need to address the economic, social, political, legal, and environmental factors that were raised. We also need to recognize that it's not over there, but it's very much here in the United States, and that it is also over there. And the last thing is that it's been normalized as invisible, and I think that one of the things is we could say it's because many people look the other way, but I think that the first step is to being knowledgeable. So knowing what human trafficking is the very first step to countering the invisibility of it, because if you know what human trafficking is, you're taking the first step towards knowing that there's a possibility for having a role. As Catherine Chong of the Polaris Project said, everyone has a role in the anti-trafficking movement, no matter how small or how big. And so on that note, I'm just going to end it, and if you have questions, I'd love to talk more, because I love talking, so thank you.
It's going to help me with my technical stuff, because they come with computers. Sorry, most people never have a problem hearing.
They will today.
Okay. I'm Jen Gosler, and I'm from San Jose Police Department. I know that's way South Valley, but this is as good as you got, okay? My partner is John Bannock, and we're in charge of the San Jose Police Department Human Trafficking Task Force. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we are, what my resources are, and redefine from my partners here, where they've got a broader scope of services and availability to service victims. For prosecution, it's pretty limited, got to stay in the lane, got to convince the DA, who eventually has to convince the court, and has to convince 12 people of the community. So it's a little bit of a challenge, but I think we're really going about it the right way. So let me tell you about my task force. The 4 counties that I'm responsible for, I'm a federally funded task force, is Santa Clara, Santa Cruz, Monterey, and San Benito. When we were awarded the task force grant in 2005, there were 2 additional task forces. One was based in San Francisco, and the other was in Oakland. Dynamics are changing. But the members of my task force, and most importantly, is the Coalition to End Human Trafficking. They are my service providers. They're the ones that are going to help me do all the victim advocacy that is necessary without me having to manage my victim case, okay? They provide language, they give them immigration information if they need it, they give them housing, they give them food, they get them to my court appearances, they make them available to me for interviews. They are right there, they're with us, because there's no way I alone could do all this work for all 4 of those counties, plus the rest of the agencies within the state that ask for my assistance, without them. Huge role. So the people we have is obviously the San Jose Police Department. We hold the money, so we put our name on there. We do have the district attorney on board with us, and this is really important. When I talk about the laws, these laws are brand new. They haven't been tested in courts. They haven't been acknowledged by society. And remember, those 12 people, they're society, so they have to recognize it. They've come up with protocols to try and help us learn how to consistently respond to human trafficking, and they're very progressive, and appropriately so, trying to make sure that the pendulum and the prosecutions are in good interests of the laws as a whole. U.S. Department of Justice, I'm a federal task force, which means I have the U.S. Attorney's Office, which technically means that any case I have, they get first right of refusal. And usually they work very closely with the district attorney's office to decide which is the best venue to prosecute a case. I have the FBI, and they're a federal agency. We each have different limitations as far as our scope of investigations, but when we work together, we get to take advantage of both of ours. I have the opportunity to make an arrest on view without a warrant. A federal agent does not. Kind of inhibits. U.S. Department of Labor, they're a really, really important component of our task force. They're able to go into any establishment and request and be provided with all the documentation and records as to the labor performed by the workers. I would need to get a search warrant, which is really not a big deal, but I would really have absolutely no idea what I was looking at. They don't. They can go in, they can examine them, they can determine if the workers are getting paid fairly, if they're having the right number of breaks, so forth and so forth. Most importantly, they're out in the fields. At 2 o'clock in the morning, down in Watsonville, they're out there with the lettuce pickers, making sure the workers are being taken care of and treated appropriately. Now, people kind of shy away and they're a little bit worried about the Department of Labor because they're a federal agency, but they are mandated that they cannot report the immigration status of any situation that they encounter to any other federal agency. So it means that you need to cooperate with the Department of Labor to keep everybody safe, but at the same time you are not jeopardizing whether or not you have a legal status. My last partner is Immigration Customs Enforcement, and they're a great partner to work with. They completely understand what human trafficking is. They are active in pursuing investigations and prosecutions. They're actually one of my favorite federal agencies to work with, but they get a bad rap. So you guys have seen this model. This is a really important model and simplification because, of course, these laws are all written by attorneys who I think get paid by the word. Okay? Just my opinion. But most importantly, we want to promote that this is the model that just about everybody in the nation breaks down this law for. This is defined by the Trafficking and Victims Protection Act of the year 2000. That's 135 years after the 13th Amendment. Okay? They realized, they had to redefine what slavery is today because the situation in 1865 is not what we have present today. So it's very simple. As we've all said, you've got the recruiting, harboring, transporting, provisioning, and painting. And state law, California does have a state law. It came into effect in 2008. Okay? It's less than 3 years old. This is only 11 years old. And these are really, really new laws. To kind of put it in perspective, when I got hired in 1884, there were no domestic violence laws. But most people in society recognized that domestic violence existed. So when the laws finally came into effect, it provided me with a tool to make people safer. It created a suspect, it created a victim. And actually, the domestic violence laws are the most restrictive laws in our penal code that I'm in charge of enforcing. It is the only law that says I shall make an arrest of the primary aggressor. Every other law says that I may make an arrest. So I get down to those single words, and that restricts my my course of action, and those are the ones I have to respect. So the difference is that these laws came into effect, and I don't believe the majority of the population recognizes that slavery is occurring here in the United States, much less here in my own backyard. Okay? So the 42 states that actually have state laws that reflect the federal laws pretty much followed and tried to mirror the TVPA's definition, California being California. Of course, instead of just having the recruiting, harboring, they said if I could articulate the violation of a person's personal liberty, then that would meet that category. Okay? Then I have to corroborate force, fraud, or coercion. And, when I ask a person is, could you leave? Could you leave the situation? No. Do you believe you could leave the situation? I recently had a case in which I was speaking to a woman, and I asked her that question, and she said, well, no. And her passport was confiscated. And I said, well, what do you need your passport for? And she goes, well, I need to buy cigarettes. So buying cigarettes is not a priority to me, but obviously her perpetrators were aware that that was something that was important to her, so by telling her that without her passport, she wasn't free to move, and she couldn't buy cigarettes. Okay? The courts have upheld that for the force, fraud, and coercion, they're working through the definition of it. We like seeing tangible things. We like seeing things that we see on TV. And unfortunately, TV's not reality, but we kind of mix them up sometimes. But in the Dan case, which was a Walnut Creek domestic servitude case, the perpetrator held up the newspaper in which there had recently been a raid by Immigration Customs Enforcement in another city, another county, and said, hey, look, they're here, they're going to come after you next. And the court upheld that that was recognizable as a justifiable form of intimidation. The officers were able to find that headline. They were able to prove that, yes, she was, in the perpetrator's custody at the time, and that the perpetrator subscribed to that newspaper. So it gave credibility and corroborated the victim's statement. So it's a little bit creative here, but sometimes that's what we have to do. Labor or services, okay, or sexual exploitation. Those are the only two things that it can be. All right? If you've been defrauded and but your personal liberty hasn't been violated, you're not a victim of human trafficking for the law. Perhaps for services, but for the law. Okay? But they added in one more thing. If my victim is a victim of sexual exploitation and they're under the age of 18, by law, I do not have to prove or corroborate the force, fraud, or coercion. Make sense? And back to state law, besides force, fraud, or coercion, the state of California added duress. And duress would be the withholding of somebody's passport, something that's personal too. So that, California kind of helped me on that one. And then they have a couple of other little purposes like kidnapping for ransom and other things like that. But this is the general term, and across the board, all partners in this effort recognize this as the definition. So things that we have, it's been reiterated, the brothels, massage parlors, street prostitution. There is no community or society in this nation that does not have sex for sale. You're just not seeing it. Nobody. Agricultural farm work, right now, my agricultural farm areas in my counties, currently, they still are profitable. But as that profit margin starts to come down, I believe the victims are going to be more vulnerable. In the current economic situation, it's my opinion that the agricultural fields will be the last place to get hit and recover, making the migrant workers victims. Cleaning services. Who has people who come into their family's houses to clean or do the lawns? Does anybody ever ask if everybody gets paid? Domestic servitude, hands down, the majority of my cases. Hands down. And bride selling, if the parties participating in the marriage are adults and nobody's been lied to or defrauded, it's actually not illegal. Okay? But if they promise to have a real marriage and children and so forth like that, but when they get here, they're actually just responsible for taking care of the dog, then you got fraud. Okay? I want to talk about the numbers. Numbers drive me crazy. Okay? I'm the only person, and I can tell you hands down, I have a national database I'm supposed to enter all my statistics. I don't know all the cases that are occurring in my own city, much less my own department, and we only have one station, much less within my county. And the reason is a number of these crimes are prosecuted under their collateral crimes. If a victim has been victimized in the sex industry, they're going to be the case is going to be prosecuted and investigated as a sex crime, which isn't a bad thing, because actually the penalties for sex crimes are significantly greater than the penalties for human trafficking. Okay? However, that doesn't preclude a victim from receiving assistance from my coalition in any way, shape, or form. All right? There does not have to be a prosecution of human trafficking in order for a victim to be identified as a human trafficking victim. And in fact, a victim can get assistance from the coalition, and I will never find out about it. If they don't want law enforcement involvement, there is no law enforcement involvement. You cannot force an adult to be a victim of any crime, and that includes this one. Okay? Let's talk about the numbers. The numbers are kind of tough. International Labor Organization is actually recognized as very, very reputable worldwide. They're doing incredible work around the world. But then we've also charged them with coming up with these disparaging numbers. Okay? So that if they're in a country doing wonderful work, they actually have to come up with a number that isn't going to piss off the government to the point that they're going to kick them out. And it has to be fairly legitimate to be recognized that they're actually doing legitimate work. So the numbers are always really, really hard. Okay? But it exists and it's here. But it's too many people. More than one person being enslaved in this country is completely unacceptable to me. Poverty. Drugs are still number one. Arms dealing and human trafficking, in which all three of these frequently cross over, are number two. Okay? But remember, drugs get sold once, people get sold repeatedly. So $31 billion. Anybody have any idea what that looks like? Neither do I. That's what it looks like. That's 1 year's profit from all these corporations combined. Everybody recognizes McDonald's, right? Okay. 1 year's profit. That's quite a bit. Let's talk about smuggling versus trafficking. Okay. We have smuggling situations that become trafficking situations, but I don't have trafficking situations that become smuggling situations. And I can show you pictures of what a smuggling situation looks like. You've seen them, way too many people on the boat, nobody's got enough food, nobody's got enough clothing on. You've got the people like tucked in all these little orifices of a vehicle that's trying to cross across the border. That is smuggling. Okay? Smuggling is the unlawful crossing of an international border. I cannot be smuggled in the United States. I'm a U.S. citizen. I was born here. Okay? Somebody has to want to enter into or be entered into another country unlawfully. Trafficking. Trafficking is the obtaining of a person, coercing them to do something that they won't want to do, and it can involve the crossing of a border. So now if you have a smuggling situation in which somebody's paid the coyote their $2,000 to cross into the United States, perhaps to work their season in the grapevines and so forth like that, but once they get here, the traffickers decide that actually, that crossing wasn't so much fun. You owe me another $2,000. You can either work in sex or your family has to bring it forward, anything like that. That creates some smuggling situation into a trafficking situation. Okay? However, for state laws, if a person is held for ransom, kidnapped and held for ransom, the penalty is 25 years for life. Okay? So the case is probably going to get prosecuted as a kidnapping for ransom because it's got a stiffer penalty. All right? Any questions about those differences? Some societies or communities trying to intermix them, it can't be mixed. So remember, it's violation of a person if it's trafficking, it's violation of a border if it's smuggling. I practice a victim-centered response. This is mandated federally as well as by state law. I absolutely love putting people in jail for crimes that they've committed. It's kind of like an ongoing career of cops and robbers. And this past Easter, I was with my brothers, and they're kind of like, well, when are you going to get a real job? And I said, I'm not having it, pal. I still get to put people in jail. But quite honestly, I would rather rescue one victim and jeopardize a criminal case than leave a victim vulnerable. Hands down, completely unacceptable. So we practice that victim-centered response. And by having those partnerships with those other organizations on my task force, I have had situations come to me involving victims, and I've had to trust to give them over to my partners like the coalition and know that when it's time, they will create the environment that will make that person feel safe enough to talk to law enforcement. And I just have to be patient for it. And it happens. It works. So what do you do if you think you have a human trafficking situation? I'm going to tell you a quick story about myself. I live in the East Bay. Live on a cul-de-sac of only 6 houses. My husband and I were the token Eastern European white people on the block. And when I started this position 3 years ago, I didn't know anything about human trafficking before it, but I recognized that my neighbor across the street, Chica, has a domestic servant. Always knew she did. I knew that her children are first-generation American. I understand there's a lot of cultural issues, and I realized that I better walk across that street and make sure that there's not a victim 30 feet from my front door before I go any further on this. Not just for the headlines in the newspaper, which would not have focused on the fact somebody was victimized, they would have focused on the fact that the officer lived right across the street from this person. So, swallowed my pride, got across the street, knocked on the door, talked to Chica, said, guess what, got a new position, and this is what I'm doing. And she said, great. And I said, so tell me about your living. Because I never saw her go outside. I don't believe she spoke English. I know she doesn't. But, I'm also gone from the house 50 hours a week working. And she was very forthright with it. It was a really difficult conversation for me, but by the end of it, we were drinking mojitos, and everything was really good. And from that stemmed invitations to her Hindu community to speak about human trafficking and the acknowledgement of culture where it crosses with laws. So these are some things that you can ask people if they want the assistance. Okay, we're working to end these barriers. We conducted outreach I know there's some nursing students here. Actually, our task force went and got our provider numbers so I can offer 2 hours of free continuing education units to people who attend classes, because I know that a majority of my victims who were seen by medical professionals were not identified as trafficking victims at the time, and they were still being held captive. And as I said, we've got bus ads, we've got multi-language posters, a human billboard campaign, and on April 1st we launched a public service announcement that runs in the movie theaters. It's a 60-second spot in the 4 counties that I work in. So it's completely outside the realm of anything I learned in the academy, but you know, being creative. And that's the contact information. Thanks.
That's the National Human Trafficking Resource Center. So you can call that number and say, I'm at Sonoma State. I want to be connected to the service provider or the law enforcement agency or the educator or whatever that's an expert on human trafficking nearest to me. And they will connect you to the closest one to you.
And they're 24 hours a day. And you can also probably call them for information. If you're doing collecting information for a paper or something like that, you can call them and speak to them. It's funded through the Polaris Project, and I'm the contact. So I hear and I speak with my counterpart in Washington, D.C. at least once a week.
Thank you so much. And now I'd like to see if there are any questions.
What kind of resources do we have in Sonoma County legally? Or, how do you have coalition partners up here?
Well, the nice thing about having such a diverse group of people on my task force is, remember, the FBI is worldwide. So if I had a situation, let's say you called the national hotline, they might refer somebody to me, I would call directly my FBI agent, and they would at least connect with whoever is responsible for this area. There is a task force out of, I believe, Sacramento, Citrus Heights area, and that's funded through a state grant. I believe San Francisco no longer has a federal grant, and I'm not clear about what's happening with Oakland. So as far as I know, San Jose is...
San Francisco does have a North Bay task force, so even though it's not funded, they still exist. And there are federal funded agencies like the SAGE Project, as well as the Asian Anti-Trafficking Collaborative, that are identified to work on human trafficking from a service provider perspective. But Sonoma is a gap area, so when I was working with service providers, one of the things that we found was that we would get human trafficking cases of both international and domestic cases, and it was a challenge with this particular region because Sacramento is far north, Alameda is far east, and we're far south, and so you have this gap area. And so I think one of the nice things about the coalitions is that they're trying to cover as much area as possible, but we're still recognizing that there are areas that we just literally cannot physically get to in enough time. And so what we've had to do is relocate survivors, which is a challenge if they have networks that support them that are healthy and not exploited in this region.
And not just on the law enforcement side. As I said, I would reach out to my coalition if I knew I had a victim. And they have their own networks. The domestic violence shelters are networked, statewide, and they're responsible for taking any female victim of any type of assault. It does not just have to be a domestic violence assault. So I would actually reach to my counterparts to help find the best services to, first priority, make them safe. Okay, we can build a case and or not build a case later. The more important thing is to make them safe. So that's where we work together.
What happens if the person entered without paperwork? Do they just get deported after they get rescued?
No, actually they don't. Remember, one of the components on my coalition is the Catherine and George Alexander Community Law Center, which is operated out of Santa Clara University. And actually they're entitled to specialized visa status, as I think Jennifer mentioned with the number. They're called T visas. And again, the threshold for obtaining a T visa is lower than the threshold for human trafficking prosecution. So that does require law enforcement cooperation. So that's where I look to my victim service providers to make my victims to a point that they can actually work with me and talk with me. And as long as they're cooperative in the investigation, they're entitled to a T visa. Other situations are a U visa. If we have a perpetrator who becomes state witness. They're entitled to an S visa, which is a creative thing to try and get, but it's doable. And then there's always something called continued presence, which is much more immediate, and that allows them, a person to be paroled into the United States during the course of the investigation and prosecution. And with each of these visas and application process, it entitles them to state and federal assistance.
Yeah, with the T visa, they issue $5,000 a year, and we've never reached the cap.
Not even close.
But with the U visa, there's $10,000, which is you're a victim of a violent crime. It's not trafficking specific. You could be a domestic violence survivor, a sex assault survivor, and so forth, and you are eligible for the U visa. That one, every year, they hit the cap on the U visa, $10,000 a year.
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest discrepancy between TV, movie kind of entertainment and real life with trafficking?
Never solved anything in an hour. Ever. You know what? It would be nice if, besides looking that great for any period of time, but, you know, we want to be entertained. We want sensationalism. I mean, people would be pretty darn bored if they followed me around for an entire week, quite honestly. But I'd rather have an amount of sensationalism than have nothing out there, because people are not paying attention to this. When we talked about cases and the witnesses, there is not a case yet that I did not encounter somebody who said, yeah, I kind of thought something was strange. Or, yeah, she asked for help, but I didn't want to get involved. You know, as I said, culturally, you know, we tend to be overly sensitive to it. I recognize culture as being very important in society, but it has to evolve with society. Even the culture in my own police work. You know, when I started in '84, you know, our briefings were pretty rowdy, and you know, it was usually at the sacrifice of somebody, what they did the day before, or something of that sort that was made fun of. Those briefings would not be appropriate today because the culture and the society and the atmosphere has changed. Okay, so as I said, it was difficult walking across to talk to Chica about her domestic servant, but before I had never seen it as such, and it would really have been inappropriate if somebody was left victimized 30 feet from me, and I just didn't want to offend them. And that was almost 4 years ago, and you know, they're still my neighbors, we're still friends.
I think that one thing, though, with the media portrayals is it doesn't get at the complexities of a case. And so, for example, I've worked with a case in which a Thai survivor of a sex trafficking, she was sex trafficked into the United States in the early 90s, continued to be exploited, continued to be trafficked in multiple forms, left in and out, and eventually she looked like what we would see someone in the U.S., that's a U.S. citizen that survives in the sex industry. She was drug addicted, and she was selling sex for drugs because she was self-soothing with drugs and surviving that way as well. So she looked like our typical survivor that's been in the sex industry for 20 years. And one of the things is that I remember going to identify the case and being like, this is really complicated. We had to get, once the case became visible, we had to get different lawyers to support her because this was an international case where we had to make sure that she wasn't deported, so then we had to get the Asian Law Caucus involved. We had to get immigration lawyers as well as civil case lawyers through Asian Pacific Islander Legal Outreach, as well as we had to get law enforcement involved. So San Francisco PD at the time was the one that came in and did the interviews that were needed to get her the visas. But even that, I think, and this happens with U.S. citizens too, is that many times they're in the criminal justice system for other crimes. But I think that the challenge is that, and that's because by its very nature, as Officer Jennifer talked about, is that there's a crossover between drug sales and human trafficking, and not in all cases. Not all human trafficking has that linkages, but many do, and when they do, that's where many times survivors of human trafficking end up in the criminal justice system.
And if I may just add, I think one of the challenges with some of the media, so on the one hand, I'm sympathetic to Jennifer's point that the media, even in its more sensationalistic leanings, might be a way to raise awareness. I think what's often left out are the really longitudinal issues that go along with this topic. So not only the resource intensity of investigating the cases, but also what are communities' investment to people who have been subject to these kinds of human rights abuses after the moment of rescue or restoration has come to pass. So 2 years, 3 years, what are some of the ways that we as a community or social service providers or law enforcement can begin to address some of these systematic issues or systemic issues that may put people in vulnerable positions even after they've left their trafficking situations.
So for example, in Los Angeles County, several of the women that I've worked with who have been identified for domestic work, though they may leave their forced trafficking situations, the only job some of them may be able to get after they've regularized their visa status are in some of the informal sectors. So I think that what the media doesn't talk about are some of the longitudinal issues that go along with the topic, and what we as a society would like to invest in if we agree that it is a very problematic human rights abuse. What do we want to invest in terms of helping and supporting victims after they've been rescued?
To what extent do you think local massage ordinances help the victims or help catch the perpetrators, as opposed to just throwing up some lots of legitimately massage therapists and
I think that one of the things, San Francisco has many ordinances with massage parlors. And I think that one of the things is that it has been a challenge. We've worked to advocate for policies that make... Thank you. We've worked to strengthen some of the massage parlor ordinances to protect workers. But I think that one of the things is that it's because I think that there's other barriers. And so we've done outreach, we've put information, we've got the Department of Public Health involved because they're the ones that give the trainings to people that work in massage parlors that certify them. And so we've worked with them very closely. But I think the challenge is that it takes a lot to identify someone, and in those kind of closed door settings, oftentimes the only time they get identified is when law enforcement gets complaints and they do a raid. Because oftentimes these survivors don't trust anyone. You can say that I'm a social service provider or I'm here to help you. But the thing is they don't trust anyone because why should they? They see the news reports, they see the information out there that's floating that says that our country is anti-immigrant. And so I think that there's the social aspect and then there's the laws. And so we've been trying to tweak them, but I don't know if San Francisco has been super successful because we know it still happens. We're still seeing multiple cases happen throughout the day of people being trafficked into massage parlors. And so I think, I don't know if I really answered the question. Maybe I don't know if San Jose even.
I can't speak to locally here. In San Jose, we have the ordinances, and actually the Shore's municipal code section says no condoms on premise. It's a 6-word statute. Remember, we got the TVPA, which is pages, and this is 6 words. And so they all the masseuses have to be licensed through the city as well as the police department. They get a background check, so if they have any priors in the sex industry, they're not eligible to work in a massage parlor in San Jose. And our undercover officers go in and get massages, and if a situation is otherwise, then they take appropriate action, and administrative citations are issued. But simply by doing an inspection by either code enforcement, the city business licensing, or the police department, if there's a condom on the property, they're in violation of their license. Okay? That only works as well as staffing goes. And to be flat out honest, they've eliminated our vice unit. So I'm a lone person in quite an office, and as of yesterday, they are eliminating 120 of our officers. So today, there are already less officers on our department than there were in 1984, and we have 250,000 more people, and I think another 30 square miles of geography to cover. So honestly, I don't know how or what's going to happen.
Yeah, but with San Francisco, if you're criminalized for prostitution charges, because prostitution is a crime in the United States, except for in some counties where it's legalized in Nevada. But I think that in California, it is illegal. And so one of the things that happens is that survivors or potential survivors, they're given an opportunity where they can go to the early intervention prostitution program in San Francisco, and instead of having that crime on their record, it's erased if the judge decides that based on the way that they've been getting support from a peer-operated program, that they've actually done their hours and so forth, they'll erase it and say like, okay, you're no longer convicted for this crime, and you can move on and not be for internationals deported from the United States because now you've done a crime of moral turpitude. And so it's definitely something we've tried to advocate for, but it's sort of the back end, it's not the prevention. And so I think that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done with prevention. The challenge with prevention is how do you show outcomes? Like how do you target things and actually show that what you're doing to prevent the problem is actually working?
And law enforcement, we don't just focus on the providers, we also provide, we do demand reduction. So we're also focusing on people seeking the services. So it's not a one-sided issue. We're not targeting the providers who are doing what they're doing for whatever their reasons. It's not just that. We're also going after people who are seeking their services.
Well, thank you guys so much.
Thank you.